Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr. Ron Ehrlich.
Well, clearly homes have become much more to us all than we ever imagined. We've dealt with issues of potential environmental toxins impacting on our health and made the point that by making informed decisions about our personal care and home care products, not to mention the food we choose to buy and cook, that we bring into all of which we bring into the house, we can reduce our toxic load by 80 to 90%. And clearly that can have a big impact on your health. We've also dealt with issues of household mold, sometimes difficult to detect, but that can have a profound impact on your immune system as well, and it's often overlooked. Another one that's overlooked is the effect of EMF, Wi-Fi radiation, and how close you keep that to your head, particularly during sleep. Well, what about how your home, and more specifically, how you arrange the things you have in your home, affects you as well? My guest today is Colin Bisset, a writer, a broadcaster with an interest in modern architecture and design. His passion has led him over the last few years to present on ABC Radio National's programs By Design and Blueprint for Living. He's particularly interested on how our homes affect our mood, productivity, health and well-being, and much, much more, which I think we've all agreed we're a lot more focused on, particularly in these last few months. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Colin Bisset. Welcome to the show, Colin.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, Colin, we are spending an awful lot of time in our homes recently, and I think we've become really conscious of the importance of our home. Now, I know you have had an interest in the way we use our home, the way we arrange our home. It's a science of Feng Shui.
Yes.
But I wondered if, before we lobbed into that and got into a few specifics, you might give us a little bit of a background as to your journey to this point.
Well, yes, happy to. I was working as an interior designer. I wasn't a trained interior designer, but so I was an interior decorator in London. And I had been working for many years decorating mainly people's homes. I was in my 20s and I loved it. I simply loved it. But I began to go through a bit of a sort of phase when I thought something was lacking. There were two things going on. Something I was feeling slightly unfulfilled, like it wasn't quite enough to be worrying about people's sofas and curtains. But also I found it very interesting going to quite a wide variety of homes and thinking, this looks lovely, but it doesn't feel very good. What's that about? Why doesn't it feel good? Is it the energy of the owner? Am I not liking them? Or what's wrong with this? And then I was on a business trip. I was flying up on British Airways. I was flying up to Aberdeen, and in the British Airways magazine, of all things, there was this article about Feng Shui in Hong Kong. I didn't know what it was. It was really the first time I'd ever heard about it. And I was just immediately, something rang a bell. And I thought, what is this? They talked about Feng Shui priests and this. So, I mean, it wasn't really my scene. But they talked about these sort of principles, the ideas of sort of setting out buildings and how buildings reacted within the landscape and how that could bring perhaps good fortune. They talked a lot about fortune and harmony and all of these sort of words that we're very used to now and can sound a bit corny. So I became very interested in it. And after that, I really, anytime I saw anything about Feng Shui, I would read about it. Then I started going to courses, and I left my interior design job and I started sort of working within Feng Shui, doing little bits of Feng Shui for people, having done courses, because I was a very sort of cynical person, but I put skeptical, not cynical. Well, I'm cynical as well, actually. I started sort of putting some of these principles into action in my own home just to see what if it worked. And I found it did. It really sort of changed things for me. And I thought, well, there's something in this. So I just kept taking it further and further, studying more, until I got to a level where I felt I could start perhaps doing it for other people, which I then began to do probably 10 years after reading that magazine. So it was a long process. And I still, even though I don't practice now with clients, it's in me, I just look at it all the time. I see it. I judge people's homes and look at people's homes and think, that's not going to work for them and whatever. So yeah, that's basically how I started.
Well, I can actually attest to the fact that your judgment of spaces has had a very positive impact on my own home, and particularly, over many years. And
Yes,
you've had a look at two of our places that we've lived in over the last 20 or 10 or 15 years. I know you said that, but over the last 10 years, you've looked at two of our houses that we've lived in, and I can attest to the fact that it does make a difference. And you've also you've taken this interest of design into media, and tell us a little bit about what you do on those programs that I mentioned in the introduction.
Well, basically, my degree is in history of art, and my specialism was in modern architecture from the 1880s, and that's a real love for me. And so I started doing some little radio pieces about my thoughts around architecture, and that developed into a fairly regular gig on ABC Radio National, just talking about specific buildings or iconic designs, the backstory around them, and putting out a few thoughts about why they're important, and trying to put things in context. Somebody in America called me a serial clarifier. And I thought, oh, I love that. I'm a serial clarifier.
Yeah,
but I think the idea of that was also in my Feng Shui practice, that I would try and put it into context, because Feng Shui is Chinese. It wasn't the Chinese part of it that interested me. I didn't really know much about the Chinese side, but it was the idea of having these principles and being able to put it into a context, so that I wasn't going in and saying, oh, we're going to hang wind chimes here, and we're going to do, have 3 metal fish here, and do that whole sort of Chinese number. I mean, there's some validity to that, but actually trying to make that work within our lives if we're not from that background. So it's sort of clarifying those principles into a more general, westernized, I suppose, environment. Generally.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I mean, Chinese culture has been around for many thousands of years, and Chinese medicine, of course, talks about meridians that run through the body and connect different parts of the body. And we've become very compartmentalized in our approach to Western medicine. And Chinese medicine also talks about a balance between yin and yang.
Yes.
And so this Feng Shui approach, what are some of the guiding principles of Feng Shui?
Well, it's very connected. I mean, all of that is very connected. It's about balance all the time. Which comes a lot out of Taoism, although Taoism was something I think that only really came relatively later. It's the idea that everything has energy in it, that there's energy coming from heaven, from above. There's energy coming from the earth. There's energy coming in blowing in the wind. And it's about sort of not just harnessing it, but placing ourselves in the optimum position, which can vary because obviously a business wants a very different energy from our home. And so, well, and also a lot of traditional feng shui was about finding the optimum burial site, so that the ancestors, your ancestors, will enjoy the harmony of heaven and earth as they go on into the afterlife. So what you'll see in China is you'll see lots of these sort of horseshoe-shaped tombs set into a hillside, and that is actually what we use when we look at homes as well. It's this idea, it's often called the armchair configuration. It's like we look for a home, for a building that has very good feng shui, to actually just be sitting into a hillside. So it's supported by a mountain, something solid and quiet behind it. It has openness in front of it, and it has side support. So it's got the support of like arms in an armchair. Now this means that the energy that's sort of coming through the atmosphere, if you like, through the landscape, is then enters the front of the building and moves quietly, beautifully around the building, and then exits. It's constantly being refreshed, but it's not just moving straight through it. I mean, if for instance, you had a house built on top of a mountain, it would be being buffeted on all sides. And to live in a place like that, you would feel very scattered, I think. You'd feel very unearthed, literally unearthed. And I've certainly gone to people's homes that have been actually on the top of hills, not particularly mountains, but hills, and they've lived there. And I have to say, they have been, fairly ungrounded, fairly sort of deranged sort of people. No, deranged is a bit bad, but they have been very scattered people and found it very unsettling to live in a site like that. So you're always looking at the building first. You're always looking at the building, and then you're looking at the rooms within. So it's very important that you look to find a mouth of qi, a strong entrance. Just like a Chinese restaurant, if you look at a Chinese restaurant, you always know where the entrance is because it's usually got a pair of these temple lions on either side, or dogs, which represent heaven and earth. One has got a ball representing heaven under its paw. The other has a little cub representing the nurturing quality of earth. So you're balancing heaven and earth just walking through the door off the pavement. And when you walk through the door, you don't just walk straight into the whole place, into the restaurant. You have a little receiving area, and often you'll actually change direction because that'll slow everything down. Because if you're coming from the street into a restaurant you want to be sort of, you're going to stay there a couple of hours, maybe. You're going to nourish yourself. You want to enjoy the atmosphere, enjoy the food, nourish through your earth, through your stomach. So you want to slow the energy. You don't want the frenetic energy of the street. Now, you want exactly this thing in your home too, because nobody wants to just go straight into the home with the same energy of the street. And so those people who do, in fact, live right on the street, there are some Victorian terraces that are built right on the street. So I have gone in, whenever I've gone into those homes, when you walk literally one step off the pavement into someone's sitting room. Okay, it can be quite exciting when you're a young person. I think that can be quite fun, just living on the street. But for most of us, we want to withdraw a little. We want that sort of sense of retreat. So the idea of the doorway being very clear so that we can get from from the street into the home easily, that it's very easy for the chi to find the way into the home. I'll just say that often I have visited clients whose homes I have found difficult to find the entrance to. So they might say, oh, I'm at number 23 of a certain street, but actually their front door's in the street at the side. There's a corner, and or I've gone up there, I've gone through a gate and there's two paths. And I think, well, I don't know which one to go up, or there'll be some lack of clarity. And often the case for the people living in that house is they feel very tired, and that they feel there's no opportunity in their life. And to me, with my using Feng Shui principles, I would say, well, opportunity doesn't know how to find you. So make it very clear. So I always say to people, make the number of your home very clear and make it very easy to find your front door, which sounds rather crazy. For most of us, it's not a problem at all. But for some people, it really is, and they just don't seem to connect it with their sort of their feeling a bit adrift, feeling undernourished, I suppose, by life. So that's a very important thing. The mouth of chi, we call it. Once you're through the door, you then try and assess how the energy is moving through the home. What are the first things you see? Is it basically you use yourself as representing how energy will feel. So if I walk into a home and the first thing I see is a window and a big view beyond, at the moment I've walked into your home and I see outside, the energy is just going straight through the house. So we need to slow things down. We need to curve things down. Similarly, if I walk into a house and the first thing I see is a sort of cloakroom and the door's open and there's a toilet, well, it's not the most nourishing, welcoming thing. It may be that in that house, everyone who walked through that door has an urgent need to go to the loo because it's like a trigger. It's often the case. It's so true. But then you look to see, well, what am I looking at? And what you want is to progress through the building. You want the building, the home, to reveal itself to you slowly, so that you would look at, there might be an artwork there, a door giving a glimpse into another room. You're led on. That's usually a mark of the chi moving throughout your home quite well. Whereas with open plan living, that's really changed things. And often, again, I've had clients who have lived in a very open plan way. I'm not saying open plan is a bad thing, but if the majority of your home is open plan, and where you have perhaps even bedrooms opening directly off just one big living area, and you also have big windows, and you might even have a big view outside, so a flat, say, might have that. It's very difficult to get a sense of calm in a place like that because your eye is just drawn everywhere. There's no sense of containment. It's very good to have rooms. I'm very pro having rooms with doors.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you're sitting in a lovely room with your door closed, I'm sure, because that gives you can concentrate properly in that room. Whereas if you were in a big open space and perhaps there's someone tiptoeing around in the distance, it's sort of distracting.
It's interesting. It's interesting to consider this trend that we have seen in the last, I guess, 10, 15, 20 years to open plan living. and sort of coordinating that with our preoccupation with globalization and looking to the outside world for our stimulation. And I think that's kind of one of the interesting things about what we're just going through in this pandemic, where we are at home and suddenly we've become more looking inwards at what we're doing. And I think that reflection of open plan living and globalization, and you talk about chi and energy. I mean, I think that, it's so interesting also to think that the Chinese have been aware of energy flow for thousands of years. And yet, it was really the breakthrough moment of Einstein saying every atom in the universe, that means every atom in our house and in our bodies, is both matter and energy. So this is what I love about the Chinese too.
It's incredible, isn't it?
This recognition of energy going back thousands of years. But yes, the getting into the house. I mean, okay, we may not, if we are living on top of a hill, we may not be able to physically change our house position.
Yes.
But once we're there, we can start doing things, and certainly the entrance is a big thing, isn't it? As you've outlined.
It is, and I would say to somebody who's perhaps living in a flat or they have quite an open plan house, if you walk straight into a room from outside, try and create some kind of just a little pausing space, even if that means putting up a screen or a bookcase or just something that stops you there, even a change of, a big rug there or something that just anchors you for a moment and gives you pause. And it means at some level, I think you sort of shed the exterior energy and you start bringing something of home. You go through a transformation. If you go into Chinese buildings, if you go into traditional, through temples and whatever, to get into to walk into the temple, you'll always step over the threshold. The door is always set high. So you have to step in, and that's to hold the outside, define the energy from outside from that inside. And often you'll go through a series of little spaces before you get into the main space. And it's all the process of shedding the outside before you're really in the inside. And I think that's exactly right, what you're saying about people really evaluating what sort of homes they actually live in and what is important to them. And I'm sure for a lot of people who've had busy city lives and home has just been somewhere to sleep in, not even necessarily to eat in, but that often, they're now looking and thinking, actually, I need a space that I really love. There's a professor of architecture at Berkeley, who I think you'd be very interested in, called Claire Cooper Marcus. And she wrote a book quite a while back in the 90s, I think, called The House as Symbol of Self. And I don't know if you know it, but
no, I don't. But it sounds exactly why we're having this conversation.
It really sort of rang big bell with me. And it was the idea of one of the things in that book. She talks about trying to look within your own home and see what is, if you share it with others, where is my area? And she found in her research that she would put a plan and ask people to say, well, which is your area? And a lot of married women would actually just colour in half of the bed or half of the bedroom and the kitchen. And I mean, really, that's rather sad, isn't it? So it's the idea of looking at what are the areas that not necessarily belong to you, but in that sense of belonging, it's about nourishing you. What are the areas that sort of give back to you? And I think for a lot of people, and I think someone commented in the media recently about everyone and their Zoom meetings. Some people just seem to be in plain white rooms. I'm sitting in a fairly plain white room myself, actually, but they don't have very much around them that seems to be nourishing them. But with these Zoom things, we're all getting sort of hung up on the background.
Getting insights into people's lives. It's quite an interesting reflection, isn't it?
Some empty lives, I think, sometimes.
Well, I mean, you mentioned two rooms there. Well, there are two things that we definitely spend a lot of time in, always have, and one of them is the bedroom.
Yes.
And more recently, we have turned parts of our houses, and if we're fortunate enough to have a specific room to call an office, that's one thing. But we'll come back to that one. But let's talk about the bedroom, because we do spend a lot of time in the bedroom, and it is very important. We talked on this program about the fact that bedrooms could have mold in them, or could have house dust mite, or you could have your head next to electromagnetic radiation. But there's something about the way the room is set up that's important as well. What would you advise people on that one?
Well, it goes back to this armchair configuration of having the mountain to support you, looking for the mountain to support you, which means really having the head of your bed against a solid wall. And that's something that's becoming more and more difficult. A lot of contemporary, all sorts of houses and flats have really quite small bedrooms. And often people will put their bed under a window. And I've had people say to me, well, I like lying there and I can look up and I can see the stars at night. And I say, well, you should be asleep. You shouldn't be looking at the stars. So what I have always suggested to people, and found generally with feedback that most people find this very good, is having the bed against a solid wall, having not necessarily, a headboard can give you a greater sense of this is the supporting part of the bed. Having side tables, I think that's important, because that's that armchair again. You're sitting there, you've got a lamp on either side, you've got nothing behind you. I say to people, don't really have pictures above the bed. Have pictures either side of the bed, fine. But if you go into a room and you look at the picture across the bed, that's where the energy is going, I always think. Whereas that means there's a sort of flow of some sort across the bed, across your sleeping form, which can be slightly disturbing. It's not that disturbing, but I think it's much better to have a sort of much quieter. The other thing is to think that in Feng Shui, we look at the qi flow as moving from the door to the window. So if it's possible for you, if your room's big enough, if you can have your bed out of that line, because there's if you drew a line between the door and the window, that is the busiest part energetically. That's the busiest part of the room. So you don't want to be sleeping there. Some rooms you will go into and you'll open the door and there's the bed right in front of you. And the person who sleeps on that side of the bed is often the one who suffers the most disturbed sleep, because during the night all they're doing is protecting the sleeping one on the other side, who's probably sleeping quite well.
I think you've just described my bedroom there. I'm protecting my wife. She sleeps incredible. She's an incredible sleeper. I'm a very light sleeper. But I am closest to, we do have our bed away from that flow, but I'm closest to it. So it's a very interesting observation that way.
Yes. But I would say, knowing your house, that you have a bedroom upstairs, and that's quite a nice long way away from the front door. A lot of people have bedrooms beside a front door, at the front of a house often. And I think there's a lot more sort of energy outside that's more difficult to get away from. Now, you can't change where your bedroom is. Well, some people can. They can choose. Often people will choose the biggest room as their master bedroom because they think, well, it's our house, we want the space. But sometimes I think the bedroom, and this is something the modernist architect Le Corbusier also agreed with, was really to have as little as possible going on in the bedroom. If possible, not even your clothes in there. I'm sure you'd agree with this, the idea of bringing external substances into the bedroom. But it's almost like the Chinese idea of sort of, keeping everything as simple as possible, as quiet as possible, your bed in the premium place, supported, quiet, not with books on the floor and a pile of things that you've got to do, and an electric clock radio and all of that sort of thing. If you can quieten it down, if you can keep it dark at night, then I think you're going to have optimum potential for good sleep.
And another issue which you just raised there is one of clutter. And I mean, let's face it. I mean, I think most people will have spent this last few months in self-isolation, observing either how much clutter they have and thinking about how they were going to reduce that in some way. What about clutter from a Feng Shui perspective?
Strictly speaking, I think from a very traditional point of view, the idea of clutter just wouldn't have existed because people just didn't have it. Yeah. So you go into a lovely, space that's people just have what they need. Nowadays, something called space clearing has become so important, and it was something that I was very skeptical about it. And I'm still a bit wary of it. I think there's, we go the Marie Kondo way of, getting everything must speak to us and we must give us joy. That's lovely, I think, if that can happen. But I think what is more important is that a sense of order, that we know, even if others might think we're fairly cluttered, we know where everything is. My own home is pretty cluttered, I must say. But I know where, if I need something, I know where it is. So often it's a matter of compromise. I think if you're with a partner who is, I'm not saying, but I'm just saying some partners are a little more messy than others. And so, you work with that. The other thing is, of course, space clearing, which is not clutter, but actually clearing the energy of a space. And this is something I was very skeptical about until I learned about it through a Balinese space clearer, an English woman who lived in Bali. And she talked about getting that the walls, our furniture holds onto the energy, especially where there's been a shock. There's been a very strong energy. So there's been arguments. There's been, severe sickness. So you try and get rid of that energy because it can keep coming back and affecting the people within that space. Now, I thought that was a bit too fancy for my liking, but I remember starting to do it, trying it out. Someone asked me to do it in a conference room in London, and they gave me no option because the person who was going to do it didn't come. And oh, come on, we've got to do the space clearing here, which basically was going around making a lot of noise, ringing bells, and clapping up the walls, and then sort of trying to dislodge the energy. So we were putting a vibration into the room that would clear the stuck vibration, and then we were opening the windows and all of that. I just thought, oh, this is far too sort of, head in the clouds sort of stuff. But I noticed after doing that for about 3/4 of an hour, the place felt very different. I really sort of felt it in my stomach, where we often feel our sort of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And I started introducing it a little bit with certain clients, because I noticed that, for instance, some people, I started seeing patterns where, say, there'd been a divorce in a house. The next people who moved in it would end up in divorce, and then and they'd sell the house, and the next people, the same thing. You'd start seeing the same thing. You'd see it in shops. One shop would keep every new person went broke for some reason, and you think, what's going on here? This history repeating in certain places. And so I think space clearing clears out that energy. A lot of people have said that that they feel the energy has completely changed, and when they've done a space clearing, they feel fresh opportunity comes into their lives, and that represents the fresh energy coming into their homes.
Yeah,
It's an interesting one.
Another one that we've all become more familiar with is working at home and in the office. And I know in our own home, just by rearranging our desks, where I'm sitting here now, I used to look into the corner of my room. My desk was faced into the corner, and ever since I have rotated my desk 90 degrees and I'm now looking at a window at my door, the door itself, it's changed. So what are some of the things that, people are working at home? What are some of the things you would say to people if they're arranging their workspace there?
Well, I would say, if possible, it's back to that old support thing again. If you can possibly work with your back to a wall and facing outwards into a room, as you see in the movie moguls sitting in their big office, sitting with a bank of power symbols, as the president does. It's a powerful position to work at a desk with your back to a wall. You don't want people behind you if possible. You want to be able to scan the room. Some people like the idea of working in a corner because they think it's private and it's concentrating. They can focus more. But I think at some level they're energetically aware of what's going on behind them. They're sort of on alert. Whereas if you take that away, so you, for instance, now sitting in that position, if anyone comes through the door, it's not a major shock. Whereas before, it might have been a shock if you were concentrating on something or were wearing headphones. So that can be very important. Having a desk lamp, putting a lamp so you have cast light onto your work area, that can help focus. And not sitting necessarily under a window, so that your focus is always drawn out of the window, which means that a task can take twice as long. So a high back chair, good chair, always is vital, I think. So it's fairly sort of simple, I think.
But I must say, both my wife and I have observed this by just that simple rotation.
So simple.
So simple. It has made a profound difference, and working at home now a lot more, it's really an important thing. Look, it's been great to cover some of these issues and raise these issues from you. I just wondered if, before we finish, and I often ask my guests this one question, so I'm going to put you on the spot here, Colin, because we're all on this health journey together through life, and what do you think the biggest challenge is for people in our modern world on their health journey? How do you see it?
Oh, that's a very big question, isn't it? I feel I'm going to come out with something a bit flip. I think the challenge is disconnection. I think it's about being connected, even though we are so, I'm sure people say this to you all the time, we are so connected, but I think in many ways we're very disconnected. We present this sort of glossy facade image to the outside world, and it's becoming more and more difficult to really sort of connect. And I think for health, I think one of the most important things is a Feng Shui thing, actually, is keeping still, doing nothing. This is the trigram of mountain energy. I've kept talking about mountain, but it's the energy of being still, allowing your time stillness, and that means your mind stillness, noticing things around you. So it's a sort of mindfulness thing, because that makes you appreciate what's really going on, and it gives you insight into how you connect and what's important for you. I think very important, and a good place to keep still doing nothing is your home. So getting that right is perfect.
Well, Colin, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective. Thank you again.
That was a great pleasure. Thanks, Ron.
Well, isn't it interesting? This whole story of energy, something that the Chinese have been aware of for thousands of years, and we still are grappling with today. And we talk about the effect of energy on our health, the fact that every atom, as I said, in the universe, every atom in our body is both energy and matter. And there are different ways of interpreting how that energy affects us. And I think looking at our built environment, looking at how we are in our homes is particularly interesting. Also, that open plan reflecting our outward-looking, globalized world becoming very popular. But there's something about our experience in the last few months, certainly, which has highlighted that our homes really are very important, and that's why I wanted to share this perspective today, which was a little bit more looking at design itself, and I thought Colin's observation about connections is something that we're all becoming aware of, and the importance of that actual connection. So look, I'll have links to Colin's site. He's a prolific blogger. He appears on those ABC Radio National programs, By Design and Blueprint for Living. So it's just been, it was terrific to connect with him and share him with you. We've got some exciting things planned in the next few months. You can also, by the way, don't forget, go and download the app, which is a lot easier to find now, because it's now, if you go to the App Store and put in Unstress with Dr. Ron Ehrlich, it will actually appear. So if you've been having trouble finding the app, it's because we just used the one word and that made it difficult. So now it's Unstress with Dr. Ron Ehrlich. And I think it's a good app to download, because we've got some exciting things coming up. There's some great resources on the app itself. If you go to the menu page and download some of the breathing exercises, some of the webinars, some of the ebooks, they're all worth looking at. And we've going to be having an e-course coming up in the next few months. So stay tuned to all of that. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner.